Jake was no stranger to the stillness of the night. Having spent years working as a night shift security guard, he had come to know the quiet that blanketed the world while others slept. Darkness had become his companion, silence his soundtrack. To some, such solitude might seem unbearable, but for Jake, it was a sanctuary, a place where the weight of the world lifted, if only for a few hours. Yet, even his years of experience hadn't prepared him for the job offer that crossed his path, a position guarding the night at St. Catherine's Hospital. When his boss handed him the assignment, Jake's emotions tangled. On the surface, he was intrigued. The hospital was infamous, a place whispered about in half-finished sentences, its history steeped in chilling rumors of strange happenings, and the paycheck was unusually generous, nearly too good to refuse. But beneath the excitement, an unshakable unease stirred. The way his boss avoided meeting his eyes, the hurried tone in his explanation, the almost palpable relief when Jake finally agreed, it all felt wrong, like a silent warning he couldn't quite hear. Still, curiosity won. The first time Jake laid eyes on St. Catherine's Hospital, he hesitated. It loomed before him like a relic of another era, a grim monument to time forgotten. Its Romanesque architecture stood dark and imposing against the starless sky. Thick brick walls, narrow arched windows, and ivy coiled like a serpent around its weathered facade. The building exhaled an air of desolation, as if it mourned its own existence, a place heavy with secrets it longed to keep buried. A dim, golden light flickered from scattered windows, its uneven glow casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked pavement leading to the entrance. It didn't soothe. It unsettled as though the building were alive, blinking in slow, labored breaths. The silence surrounding the hospital was oppressive, broken only by the faint rustle of dead leaves carried on a cold breeze. Jake felt it then, the weight of unseen eyes watching him from the shadows. "Just a building," he murmured, forcing himself to move forward, though the words tasted hollow. Inside, the unease deepened. A fellow guard greeted Jake, an older man with tired eyes and a face carved from stone. After a curt nod, he handed Jake a folded piece of paper. "Read this carefully," the man said, his voice low, deliberate, each word heavy with warning. Jake unfolded the paper and scanned the list. The rules were strange. No, they were absurd. Sir. Rule 1. Be inside the security room by 10 p.m. sharp. Rule 2. Ignore the woman who may knock at the door asking for her husband. Rule 3. Keep the ICU lights on at all costs. Rule 4. Follow the instructions if a little girl appears in the cafeteria. The list went on, each rule more bizarre than the last. Jake chuckled nervously, assuming it was some kind of hazing ritual. "Is this for real?" he asked, raising an eyebrow, a faint smirk on his lips. The older guard didn't smile. His expression darkened, and he leaned in, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Follow them, every single one. If you don't..." He hesitated, his gaze darting to the darkened corridor behind them. "They'll know." Jake's smirk vanished. A chill crept up his spine. "Who's they?" he asked, his voice quieter than he intended. But the guard didn't answer. Instead, he straightened, his face grim, and gave Jake one final warning before stepping away. "Be careful," he said, his words heavy with dread. "They're always watching." Jake stood alone, the silence pressing in like a weight. For the first time, he questioned if this was just another job, or something far more sinister. Jake began his first patrol with confidence. Armed with a flashlight and his years of experience, he set off to explore the hospital. The air was cool, and his boots echoed softly against the tiled floors. Starting from the highest floor, he methodically checked every room and hallway. Empty rooms, locked doors, the occasional creak of an old building settling into the night. It all seemed straightforward at first, but the deeper Jake ventured, the more oppressive the silence became. It wasn't the peaceful quiet he was used to. It was stifling, almost alive. It felt as though the walls were listening, holding their breath, waiting for something. The emptiness gnawed at him. Hospitals were places of life, even at night. Nurses on rounds, doctors on call. But here there was nothing. No sound, no presence. Just him, and the unsettling realization of how utterly alone he was. The first encounter. Jake reached the ICU, its fluorescent lights casting a cold, sterile glow. He was about to turn back when he saw it. A man stood in one of the rooms, his back turned. His posture was stiff, unnatural, like a mannequin frozen mid-motion. "Excuse me, sir," Jake called, his voice steady despite the sudden weight in his chest. "You're not supposed to be here. I need you to leave." The man didn't respond. Jake took a step closer, repeating himself. The figure stirred, slowly turning his head just enough for Jake to glimpse a sliver of his face, weathered skin, hollow eyes that sank into a shadow too deep to be natural. Jake's hand tightened around his flashlight. "Sir," he said again, his voice faltering now. The man finally nodded. Without a word, he shuffled toward the door. Jake's shoulders eased. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was just... The man stopped in the doorway, turning his head ever so slightly. His voice was a whisper, but each word sliced through the stillness like glass. "Beware the surgeon." And then he was gone. The shadows outside swallowed him whole. Jake didn't move. The words clung to him, reverberating in his skull. It had to be a joke. A test, maybe. A way to see how much he could handle. But the knot tightening in his chest wouldn't let him laugh. It wouldn't let him shake the feeling that something was wrong. The ICU blackout. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the hallway into blackness. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. Then it came, a scream. A raw, agonizing wail that shattered the silence and sent ice racing through his veins. It echoed everywhere, impossible to pinpoint, as though the hospital itself were crying out. His flashlight clicked on with a shaky hand. He told himself it was another prank, another scare tactic, but his trembling fingers betrayed him. The scream faded, but something worse took its place. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Growing louder. Closer. Jake bolted. His boots thundered down the hallway as his breath came in gasps. He turned the corner and spotted a bathroom door. His hands fumbled for the handle, yanking it open. He threw himself inside, locked the door, and pressed his back against the cold tile. Silence, just for a moment. Then the footsteps stopped. Right outside. Jake pressed his ear to the door, his chest heaving, his heart slamming against his ribs, and then it came, a whisper, low, soft, and impossibly close. "Jake, I know you're in there." He bit down on his lip to keep from making a sound. His hand clamped over his mouth as the thing outside continued. "Come out, Jake. I need your help." The doorknob rattled, and Jake's breath hitched. The whisper grew softer, more playful. "Come out." He stayed frozen, his mind racing, every muscle in his body screaming to flee. But there was nowhere to go. He could only wait. Finally, the footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. Jake exhaled shakily, his body sagging against the door. But relief didn't come. He knew the night was far from over. The cafeteria encounter. The cafeteria was eerily empty when Jake stepped inside, hoping for a brief moment to steady himself. The faint hum of the refrigerator buzzed in the air, accompanied by the occasional flicker of the harsh fluorescent lights above. He moved toward the coffee machine, his hands trembling from everything he'd seen so far. The smell of burnt coffee grounds hung in the air, familiar yet far from comforting. He reached for a cup, but a soft rustling noise made him freeze. Jake turned, and that's when he saw her. Sitting at one of the cafeteria tables was a little girl. No older than 7 or 8, her blonde curls framed a pale, expressionless face. She wore a pink t-shirt and a white skirt, her small legs dangling from the chair as though she'd been waiting patiently for someone. In her hands was a tattered teddy bear, one button eye dangling precariously by a single thread. Her head tilted slightly, and their eyes met. Jake's stomach tightened. There was something deeply wrong about her presence, something unnatural. "Hey, are you lost?" he asked, his voice breaking the suffocating silence. She didn't answer. Instead, her lips curved into a slow, deliberate smile, one that stopped just short of her eyes. It wasn't a child's smile. It was something far colder, far older. And then she spoke, her voice soft, lilting, but laced with a sinister edge. "Do you want to play a game? The invitation to hide and seek." The words sent a chill crawling down Jake's spine. His mind reeled as he remembered the rules. "If she speaks, you must respond." I'm working," he stammered, his voice uneven. "I can't play right now." Her smile widened, teeth peeking through as she stood from the chair, clutching the teddy bear tightly against her chest. She took a step toward him, her voice shifting into a haunting sing-song. "Hide and seek. You hide, and we'll find you." Every instinct screamed at Jake to get out. He didn't think. He turned and bolted, his boots hammering against the tile floor as her voice trailed after him, light and melodic. 1, 2, 3. Forever with me, you'll be. The sound of her counting echoed in the empty halls, growing fainter with each step, but the chill it left behind clung to him. He reached the security room and slammed the door shut, locking it with shaking hands. He leaned back against the wall, his chest heaving, heart pounding in his ears. For a brief moment he felt relief, fragile, fleeting, but the weight of her words hung in the air, suffocating him. He wasn't safe. Not yet. Hiding in the ceiling, her counting continued, distant yet inescapable. It bounced off the cold walls of the hospital, its sing-song rhythm pulling him deeper into his growing panic. 47, 48, 49. Jake scanned the security room frantically, looking for a place to hide. His eyes landed on the ceiling tiles. He climbed onto the desk, shoving one aside and hauling himself up into the dark, dusty crawl space above. The sharp edges of the metal framework dug into him as he pressed his body flat, struggling to control his breathing. The footsteps came closer. Each step was light but deliberate, their sound amplifying the stillness of the hospital. She was inside the room now. He heard the faint squeak of her shoes against the tile. Tap! 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 The sound of a broomstick probing the ceiling tiles jolted him, the vibrations rattling through the metal framework. Dust sifted down through the cracks, falling onto his face as he squeezed his eyes shut, trying to make himself smaller. I know you're here. Her voice sang out softly, childlike yet dripping with menace. The tapping grew louder, closer, each strike a cruel mockery of his hiding spot. Jake clenched his jaw, forcing himself not to flinch as the vibrations crawled through the framework beneath him. 1, 2, 3. Her voice was soft now, almost a whisper, but it filled the room like a presence, inescapable and suffocating.
The climax!
The broom jabbed the tile just inches from his face, dislodging more dust into the air. Jake's muscles burned, his heart hammering in his chest. Every nerve screamed for him to move, to flee. But he stayed frozen, terrified of the slightest sound. Her voice came again, so close it felt like it was inside his ear. I'll find you. And in that moment, Jake knew. She wasn't lying. The surgeon on the camera. Sitting in the security room, Jake leaned back in his chair, his chest still heaving as he tried to shake off the lingering terror from the girl's twisted game. The silence pressed in, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the low hum of the monitors in front of him. He forced himself to focus, scanning the flickering screens for any sign of activity. And then, he saw him. On the ICU camera, a figure stood unnaturally still. The man wore blood-streaked surgical scrubs, his face partially obscured by a mask. In one hand, he gripped a jagged surgical saw, its serrated edge catching the faint light overhead. His head was tilted to one side, as though listening for something only he could hear. Jake's breath caught as the man suddenly turned toward the camera. Wide, bulging eyes stared back at him, gleaming with a manic intensity that froze the blood in Jake's veins. Then, slowly and deliberately, the man reached up and pulled the mask down, revealing a grotesque smile. The teeth were sharp, unnaturally so, bared in a grin that split his face like a gash. And then he laughed. The sound that came through the speakers wasn't human. It was deep and guttural, distorted like a corrupted audio file. It clawed its way into Jake's ears, sending a visceral shiver down his spine. His body locked up, paralyzed by a fear so raw it made his skin crawl. The chase begins. The surgeon moved. At first, his steps were slow and deliberate, echoing through the ICU corridor. Then came the metallic scrape. The jagged saw dragged along the floor, its grating noise cutting through the silence like a blade through flesh. Jake's paralysis shattered. Adrenaline surged, and he bolted from the security room, his boots slamming against the tiled floor in panicked rhythm. Behind him, the scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic hum. The surgeon was following, and he wasn't in a hurry. Jake's heart pounded as he sprinted blindly through the hospital's maze of corridors. The oppressive darkness seemed to close in around him, every shadow twisting into a figure, every corner hiding unseen eyes. He rounded a corner, nearly slipping on the polished floor, and spotted a janitor's closet beneath the stairs. Without hesitation, he yanked the door open, slipped inside, and pulled it shut as quietly as his trembling hands would allow. Hiding in the closet. The air inside was thick and foul, saturated with the stench of rotting garbage. Jake crouched low behind a stack of cleaning supplies, his breath shallow and desperate to stay silent. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, drowning out everything else. Outside, the scraping stopped. Jake strained to hear, his body trembling as he pressed himself deeper into the shadows. For a long, suffocating moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, piercing the void, came a new sound, the high-pitched whirring of a drill. The noise grew louder, sharper, cutting through the stillness like a scream of its own. Jake clamped his hands over his ears, but it was useless. The sound burrowed into his skull, relentless and unyielding. It was joined by a scream, agonizing, raw, and inhuman. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, bouncing off the walls in a haunting symphony of terror. Jake's entire body shook, his hands trembling as the scream abruptly stopped. Silence fell once more, broken only by slow, heavy breathing just beyond the door. The closet door creaked open, and a sliver of light spilled into the room. Jake didn't move. He didn't breathe. His entire body was frozen in place, his eyes locked on the widening crack of the door. Every nerve in his body screamed for him to flee. But he was trapped, paralyzed by the fear that any movement might draw the surgeon closer. The whispered promise. Then, cutting through the still air, came a voice. Soft, chilling, whispered directly into his ear. "We'll meet again." Jake's blood turned to ice. His body twisted instinctively, whipping around toward the source of the sound. The closet was empty. The breathing stopped. The door creaked shut again, sealing Jake in the suffocating darkness. The only sound left was the faint echo of the surgeon's laughter, fading into the void, and the rhythmic thudding of Jake's terrified heart. The breaking dawn. As dawn broke, the relentless horrors of the night seemed to falter. The footsteps that had haunted Jake for hours ceased, replaced by an eerie, almost deafening silence. St. Catharina's Hospital, once alive with unseen terrors, now stood still. It was as if the building exhaled, letting the morning light cleanse its darkened halls. Jake's legs trembled as he pushed open the heavy doors. The first rays of sunlight hit his face, warm, blinding, momentarily comforting. For a fleeting moment, relief washed over him, a fragile hope that daylight might banish the nightmares of the night. But even as he stepped into the outside world, the suffocating weight of the hospital clung to him, like a shadow that refused to let go. The creak of the doors behind him sounded like a whisper, a calling, beckoning him back. Jake didn't dare look over his shoulder. He walked to his car with shaky steps, his hands fumbling for the keys, his breath uneven. The hospital's silhouette loomed in his rearview mirror as he drove away, but no distance felt like enough to truly escape. The haunting begins. At home, Jake tried to rebuild the fragile pieces of normalcy. He cleaned, cooked, and buried himself in mundane tasks, desperate to convince himself that the horrors were over. But deep down, he knew they weren't. The feeling of being watched never left. It followed him everywhere, in the kitchen, in the shower, even in the daylight. At night, it was worse. The whispers would start, so faint they seemed to seep from his own mind. Sometimes he heard a child's eerie, sing-song melody, carrying an unmistakable chill. Other times, just his name, soft and drawn out, Jake. Sleep was no escape. Every dream dragged him back to St. Catharina's Hospital, its endless corridors stretching before him. The little girl was always there, counting slowly, her voice growing louder with each number. The surgeon lingered too, his grin grotesque, his saw gleaming, always waiting. Each night he woke gasping for air, the darkness of his room suffocating, alive with unseen menace. Jake began to dread sleep, knowing it would only deliver him back to the horrors he'd tried to leave behind. An ominous return. A week later, Jake found an envelope on his doorstep. His name was scrawled across the front in hurried, uneven handwriting. No return address. He stared at it, a cold knot forming in his stomach. With trembling hands, he tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The heading made his heart lurch. Security Guidelines for Night Patrol, St. Catharina's Hospital. His hands shook as he scanned the list. The rules were different, but the chilling weight of them was the same. His breath caught at the final line. Rule 8. You can never leave. The words burned into his mind. The air seemed to thicken around him as he stared at the page, his thoughts racing. How had this found him? Was this a cruel prank? Or was it something worse, something inescapable? Jake's final reflection. Sitting alone in the dim light of his living room, Jake clutched the paper in his trembling hands. Shadows crept along the walls, long and oppressive. He whispered to himself, his voice barely audible, heavy with resignation. Sometimes it's not us who choose to face the darkness, it's the darkness that chooses us. His voice cracked as the weight of the words settled over him. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of crimson. The shadows in his room grew deeper, swallowing the light. Somewhere in the distance, a faint sound began to echo, a child's voice, soft and haunting. 1, 2, 3. Jake froze, his breath caught in his throat. The counting grew louder, closer, reverberating through the silence of his home. The screen fades to black.